The rise and fall of Sparta. There are few names in history that carry the weight of Sparta. Even now, more than 2,000 years after the last Spartan hoplite laid down his shield, the word itself conjures images of discipline, sacrifice, and martial excellence. Sparta has become a symbol, a myth, a cultural shorthand for toughness and military prowess that transcends time and place. Athletes invoke it when pushing through pain. Military units claim its legacy. Motivational speakers use it as shorthand for dedication and sacrifice. But symbols are dangerous things. They obscure as much as they reveal, simplifying complexity, erasing nuance, and transforming human beings into legends. This is the story of Sparta as it truly was. Not the Sparta of Hollywood films or motivational speeches, but the real city-state that rose from the rocky soil of southern Greece, built an empire on terror and discipline, and then slowly, inevitably, collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. It is a story of extraordinary military achievement and profound moral failure. It is a story of how a society can become so focused on survival that it forgets how to live. And it is a story that speaks to something fundamental about human nature, about the price of power, and about the dangers of building a civilization on fear. To understand Sparta, we must begin not with battles or warriors, but with the land itself. Geography is destiny, and nowhere is this more true than in the case of Sparta. The story begins in a valley, hemmed in by mountains, isolated from the wider Greek world. It begins with a people who would turn that isolation into strength, and that strength into tyranny. And it begins with a question that would haunt Sparta for its entire existence. How do you maintain control when you are vastly outnumbered by those you have enslaved? The answer to that question would shape everything that followed. It would create the most feared army in the ancient world. It would forge a culture of such rigid discipline that it bordered on inhumanity. And ultimately, it would doom Sparta to irrelevance, as the very qualities that made it powerful also made it brittle, inflexible, and incapable of adapting to a changing world. This is the complete story of Sparta, from its mythic origins to its final fade into obscurity. It is a long story, spanning centuries of warfare, political intrigue, and cultural evolution. It is a story of heroes and villains, though often the two are indistinguishable. We will walk through the valleys of Laconia and understand why this particular patch of earth gave birth to such a peculiar society. We will examine the brutal education system that turned boys into weapons. We will stand on the battlefield at Thermopylae and understand why 300 men chose to die rather than retreat. We will watch as Sparta defeated Athens and became the hegemon of Greece, only to discover that victory can be more dangerous than defeat, and we will witness the long, slow decline as demographic collapse, economic inequality, and strategic rigidity transformed the once mighty Spartans into a tourist attraction for wealthy Romans. Part 1. The Birth of Sparta. The land that made them, Laconia, sits in the southeastern corner of the Peloponnese, a roughly triangular territory bounded by mountains on 3 sides and the sea on the 4th. To the west, the Taygetus mountain range rises like a wall, its peaks often snow-capped even in summer, its slopes thick with forests of pine and oak. To the north and east, lesser but still formidable ranges create natural barriers between Laconia and its neighbors, and to the south lies the Laconian Gulf, opening onto the Mediterranean Sea. At the heart of this region flows the Eurotas River, carving its way through the valley floor from north to south, eventually emptying into the Gulf. The Eurotas Valley is the beating heart of Laconia, a ribbon of fertile soil where wheat and barley can be grown, where olive trees produce their precious oil, and where grapevines yield wine. It is not the richest agricultural land in Greece. That distinction belongs to places like Boeotia or Thessaly, but it is sufficient. More importantly, it is defensible. This geographical reality would shape Spartan history in profound ways. The mountains that surrounded Laconia made invasion difficult. There were passes, of course, narrow routes through the highlands where an army could march, but these could be defended by relatively small forces. An invader would have to commit substantial resources to penetrate Laconian territory, and even then, they would find themselves funneled into predictable routes where ambush and defensive warfare favored the locals. This natural fortress quality allowed Sparta to develop without the constant external pressure that shaped other Greek city-states like Athens or Corinth, which faced threats from multiple directions and had to maintain constant vigilance. But geography is a double-edged sword. The same mountains that protected Laconia also isolated it. While coastal cities like Athens or Corinth engaged in extensive maritime trade, building wealth through commerce, and developing cosmopolitan cultures through contact with foreign peoples, Sparta remained relatively cut off from these networks. The city itself was located well inland, about 40 kilometers from the sea, too far for easy maritime commerce, but close enough that the port at Githæan could be reached when necessary. This inland position reflected a choice, or perhaps an inevitability. Sparta would not be a trading power. It would not grow rich through commerce. It would be a land power, focused inward, concerned primarily with controlling what it already possessed. And what it possessed, or would soon possess, was not just land, but people. The Eurotas Valley could support a population, but it required labor to work the fields. This basic economic reality would drive much of Spartan history. A warrior class cannot feed itself. It requires others to produce food while it trains for war. In most Greek city-states, this labor was provided by a mix of free farmers, hired workers, and slaves, purchased from foreign wars. Sparta would take a different path, one that would define its character and seal its fate. It would enslave its neighbors, creating a permanent underclass whose hatred would shape every aspect of Spartan life, the Mycenaean foundation. Long before there was a Sparta, there was a Greek world. This Greece was different from the classical civilization we think of when we hear the name. It was the Greece of the Bronze Age, a world of palace states ruled by kings who commanded warrior aristocracies, collected tribute from peasant farmers, and recorded their transactions in a script we now call Linear B. These were the Mycenaeans, named after their most famous palace at Mycenae, though in truth there were many such centers, scattered across Greece and the Aegean Islands. Laconia was part of this Mycenaean world. Archaeological evidence reveals that there were settlements in the Eurotas Valley during the late Bronze Age, likely centered around what would later become Sparta. These settlements were not large by Mycenaean standards, nothing comparable to the great palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, or Thebes, but they were part of the broader cultural and economic network that connected Bronze Age Greece. The Mycenaean world was hierarchical and militarized. Palace bureaucracies kept detailed records of agricultural production, craft goods, and religious offerings. Warriors formed a distinct class, equipped with bronze armor and weapons that were expensive and prestigious. These warriors rode to battle in chariots, a technology borrowed from the Near East, and they dominated the battlefield with their superior equipment and training. This world came to an end around 1200 BC, part of a broader collapse that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean. Palaces burned, trade networks disintegrated, and literacy disappeared. The reasons for this collapse are still debated by scholars. Climate change, crop failures, invasions by sea peoples, internal revolts, all of these factors may have played a role. What matters for our story is the result, The Mycenaean world fragmented, the palace states ceased to exist, and Greece entered a period we call the Dark Age, not because it was necessarily worse than what came before, but because we know so little about it. For several centuries, Greece became a world of villages rather than palaces, of oral tradition rather than written records, of local chieftains rather than powerful kings. Population declined. Trade diminished. Many of the crafts that had flourished in the Bronze Age were lost, including bronze working itself for a time, as tin became scarce and iron began to replace bronze as the primary metal for tools and weapons. But even in this dark age, Laconia remained inhabited. People continued to live in the Eurotas Valley, to farm its soil, to herd animals in the surrounding hills. They remembered in some form the older world that had existed. They told stories of heroes and kings, stories that would eventually be woven into the great epic poems attributed to Homer, and they maintained some continuity of culture and language. When Greece began to emerge from the Dark Age in the 8th century BC, the people of Laconia still spoke Greek, still worshipped the same gods, still understood themselves as part of a broader Hellenic world. The Dorian invasion. The story of the Dorian invasion is one of the most contentious topics in ancient Greek history. The ancient Greeks themselves believed that a migration had occurred, that a new group of Greek-speaking people had moved into the Peloponnese and other areas during or shortly after the collapse of the Mycenaean world. These newcomers were the Dorians, and they supposedly displaced or conquered the previous inhabitants who were called Achaeans or sometimes Ionians. The legend went like this. After the Trojan War, the great Mycenaean heroes returned home. Agamemnon was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra. The kingdom of Mycenae descended into chaos. Around this time, the descendants of Heracles, the greatest of all Greek heroes, decided to reclaim their rightful inheritance. Heracles had been exiled from the Peloponnese through the machinations of jealous gods, but his descendants, the Heraclids, believed they had a divine right to return and rule. They allied themselves with the Dorian tribes of northern Greece and invaded the Peloponnese. After several failed attempts, they finally succeeded. The Heraclids became the new ruling dynasties of several Peloponnesian states, including Sparta, which was granted to the descendants of Heracles as their portion of the conquered land. This is mythology, not history, but like all myths, it contains fragments of historical memory. The ancient Greeks believed the Dorians represented a distinct ethnic group within the broader Greek family. They spoke a particular dialect of Greek, Doric, which differed in significant ways from the Ionic and Aeolic dialects spoken in other regions. They had their own cultural practices and religious festivals, and they claimed a special connection to certain gods, particularly Apollo. Modern archaeology and linguistics have complicated this picture considerably. There is no clear evidence of a sudden, violent invasion that replaced one population with another. Instead, what seems to have happened is more gradual and more complex. During the Dark Age, populations shifted and mixed. Some areas depopulated, others saw new settlements. Cultural practices changed, but not in a uniform way that suggests conquest. What we can say with some confidence is that by the time Greece emerged from the Dark Age, the people living in Laconia spoke Doric Greek and identified themselves as Dorians. They believed, whether accurately or not, that they were descended from invaders who had conquered the region. This belief mattered enormously because it shaped how they understood their relationship to the land and to the people who lived there before them. The Spartans would develop an origin story that emphasized conquest and superior right. They were the descendants of Heracles, the greatest hero of Greek mythology. They had taken the land by force, and therefore they had every right to rule it. This was not merely propaganda. It was a fundamental part of Spartan identity. They were conquerors who maintained their position through military strength and eternal vigilance. This self-conception would inform every aspect of Spartan society, from their treatment of the helots to their foreign policy, from their education system to their government structure. The conquest of Messenia. By the 8th century BC, Greece was changing rapidly. The population was growing. New settlements were being founded, both in Greece itself and in far-flung colonies around the Mediterranean. Trade was increasing. Literacy was returning, this time using a new alphabet borrowed and adapted from the Phoenicians. Across the Greek world, communities were organizing themselves into city-states, called polis in Greek. Sparta was one of these emerging polis. It occupied a favored position in the Eurotas Valley, and by the mid-8th century, it had established dominance over most of Laconia. This expansion was not the result of a single conquest, but rather a gradual process of warfare, intimidation, and assimilation. Smaller communities were incorporated into the Spartan state, their inhabitants becoming either full citizens or subordinate allies, known as perioikoi, literally, those who dwell around. The perioikoi occupied an unusual position in Spartan society. They were free, not slaves. They could own property, engage in trade, and manage their own local affairs. But they had no political rights in Sparta itself. They could not vote in Spartan assemblies or hold Spartan offices. In return for their subordinate status, they received Spartan protection and were obligated to fight in Spartan wars. The perioikoi would eventually inhabit settlements all across Laconia and even beyond, forming a buffer between the Spartan citizens and potentially hostile neighbors. They also performed economic functions that Spartan citizens increasingly disdained, such as trade and craft production. But Laconia alone was not enough. The Eurotas Valley was fertile, but it was not large. If Sparta wanted to grow, to become a major power in the Greek world, it needed more land. And just to the west, beyond the barrier of the Taygetus Mountains, lay an inviting prize, Messenia. Messenia was a region similar to Laconia in many ways. It had its own river valley, carved by the Pamissos River, with rich agricultural land even more extensive than what Laconia offered. It was inhabited by Greek-speaking people who worshipped the same gods and shared much of the same culture as the Spartans. But it was politically independent, divided among several communities, and not particularly unified. Around 740 BC, or perhaps a bit earlier, the Spartans made a momentous decision. They would invade Messenia and seize its land. This was not a typical Greek war, fought for glory or to settle a specific dispute. This was a war of conquest, aimed at permanent annexation, and it was a war that would take decades to complete. The First Messenian War, as it came to be known, was brutal and protracted. The Messenians resisted fiercely. They had their own warriors, their own sense of honor and independence. According to later Greek traditions, they were led by a king named Euphrates, and later by the hero Aristomenes, though these figures may be more legendary than historical. What is clear is that the Messenians did not simply capitulate. They fought in the open field when they could, and they retreated to strongholds in the mountains when they could not. The Spartans, for their part, prosecuted the war with determination. They sent army after army across the Taygetus Mountains. They besieged Messenian strongholds and devastated the countryside. Gradually, over the course of perhaps 2 decades, they wore down Messenian resistance. The decisive moment may have come at a place called the Great Trench, where the Spartans broke a major Messenian defensive position. After that, organized resistance collapsed. By around 720 BC, Messenia was under Spartan control. But what to do with it? The Spartans faced a choice: They could treat the Messenians as they had treated the Perioikoi, allowing them a degree of autonomy in exchange for military service. Or they could take a more drastic step. They chose the latter. The Messenians were enslaved en masse. They were transformed into helots, a Greek word that may derive from Helos, a town in Laconia whose inhabitants had been similarly enslaved in earlier times. The helots were not chattel slaves who could be bought and sold as individuals. They remained on the land, farming the estates that now belonged to Spartan citizens. But they had no freedom, no rights, and no hope of advancement. They were state property, bound to the land, and required to hand over a fixed portion of their produce to their Spartan masters. This solution to the Messenia problem was elegant in its way. The Spartans now controlled a vast agricultural territory without having to work it themselves. They could devote themselves entirely to military training, secure in the knowledge that their food was being produced by others. Messenia would turn Sparta into a wealthy state, at least by the standards of the early Archaic period. Spartan citizens could live as full-time warriors, a rarity in the Greek world, where most men had to balance military service with the demands of farming. But this solution also created a problem that would haunt Sparta for the rest of its existence. The Helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans. Estimates vary, but it is likely that Helots outnumbered full Spartan citizens by at least 7-1, possibly more. These were not foreigners captured in distant wars. They were Greeks, speaking the same language, worshipping the same gods, and remembering a time when they had been free. They hated their masters with an intensity that would shape every aspect of Spartan society. The enslavement of Messenia was the original sin of Sparta, the decision that set it on a path from which it could never deviate. Having made this choice, the Spartans would spend the next several centuries living in fear of a Helot revolt. That fear would militarize their society to an extraordinary degree. It would shape their education system, their government, their foreign policy, and ultimately their decline. To understand Sparta is to understand that it was a society built on a foundation of terror, and that the terror flowed in both directions. The Second Messenian War and the forging of Sparta. For a generation or two after the First Messenian War, the arrangement seemed to work. The Helots labored in the fields. The Spartans trained for war and enjoyed the fruits of others' labor. Sparta grew in power and prestige, but beneath the surface, resentment festered. The Messenian Helots had not forgotten their freedom. They told their children stories of independence, of kings and heroes, of a time before the Spartans came. And they waited for an opportunity. That opportunity came around 660 BC, when a combination of internal instability in Sparta and external pressures created a moment of weakness. The exact causes of what became the Second Messenian War are unclear. Ancient sources suggest that the Helots revolted, possibly encouraged by other Greek states who resented Sparta's growing power. Some traditions speak of a Messenian hero named Aristomenes who rallied the Helots and led them in a decades-long guerrilla war against their former masters. What is certain is that this was an existential crisis for Sparta. If the Helots succeeded in throwing off their chains, the entire economic foundation of Spartan society would collapse. Sparta would lose not only Messenia, but its wealth, its power, and its ability to maintain a warrior class. The Spartans fought with the desperation of men defending their very existence. The Second Messenian War lasted longer than the first. Some ancient sources claim it stretched for nearly 20 years. The Messenians, knowing that they could not defeat the Spartans in open battle, retreated to the mountain stronghold of Ira in northern Messenia. There they held out, raiding Spartan territory, disrupting harvests, and inspiring Helots in other areas to resist or flee. The Spartans besieged Ira but found it nearly impossible to take. The mountain position was strong, and the defenders were motivated by the knowledge that defeat meant re-enslavement or death. Eventually, through persistence and perhaps treachery, the Spartans managed to take Ira. The exact details are lost to history, but the result was clear. The Messenian revolt was crushed. Those who had taken up arms were killed or enslaved more harshly than before. Aristomenes, if he truly existed, either died in the final battle or escaped into exile, depending on which version of the story one believes. But the Spartans had learned a terrible lesson. They had come perilously close to losing everything. The Helots, despite being outnumbered and poorly armed, had nearly succeeded in breaking free. This could never be allowed to happen again. If Sparta was to survive, it needed to become something more than just another Greek city-state. It needed to become a military society totally dedicated to internal control and external strength. Every institution, every law, every aspect of life had to serve the single purpose of preventing another Helot. Revolt. This was the moment when Sparta truly became Sparta. In the aftermath of the Second Messenian War, the Spartans undertook a radical reorganization of their society. They created the system that would make them unique among all Greek states, the system that would turn them into the most feared warriors in the Mediterranean, and the system that would ultimately destroy them. Lycurgus and the Great Retra. The Greeks attributed this reorganization to a single man, Lycurgus. Lycurgus is one of the most mysterious figures in ancient history. We do not know when he lived. Ancient sources place him anywhere from the 9th century to the 7th century BC. We do not know if he was a king, a guardian of an infant king, or simply a wise lawgiver. We do not even know, with certainty, if he existed at all. Some modern scholars believe that Lycurgus was a mythical figure, a personification of Spartan law itself, not a real historical person. What we do know is that the Spartans themselves believed in Lycurgus absolutely. They credited him with creating their entire system of government and education. They believed that he had traveled to the great oracle at Delphi and received divine approval for his laws. They even claimed that before implementing his reforms, he had made the Spartans swear an oath to follow his laws until he returned from Delphi. Then, to ensure the laws would remain unchanged forever, he starved himself to death, never returning, so that the Spartans would be bound by their oath for all time. This story is almost certainly legend, but it reveals something important about Spartan psychology. They believed their system was not the product of human invention, but of divine wisdom channeled through an inspired lawgiver. This made the system sacred, unchangeable, and above criticism. To question Spartan law was to question the gods themselves. The core of the Lycurgan system was a document known as the Great Retra, a kind of constitutional agreement that established the fundamental structure of Spartan government. The text of the Great Retra was recorded by the ancient writer Plutarch, though by his time it was already centuries old and written in an archaic dialect that was difficult to understand. The Retra established several key principles. First, Sparta would be ruled by 2 kings simultaneously, drawn from 2 distinct royal families, the Aeacids and the Eurypontids. This dual kingship was unusual but not unprecedented in the Greek world. The 2 kings would share military command and religious duties. The system created a balance, or perhaps a competition, that prevented any single king from accumulating too much power. Second, there would be a council of elders, called the Gerousia, consisting of 28 men over the age of 60, plus the 2 kings. The Gerousia would prepare legislation and make important decisions about policy. Membership in the Gerousia was for life and was considered the highest honor a Spartan could achieve, short of the kingship itself. Third, there would be an assembly of all Spartan citizens, called the Apella. The Apella would vote on proposals put forward by the Gerousia. Importantly, the assembly could not propose legislation itself. It could only approve or reject what the elders suggested. This limited the power of the common citizen while still giving him a voice in governance. Fourth, there would be 5 magistrates called ephors, elected annually by the assembly. The ephors were watchdogs, responsible for supervising even the kings and ensuring that everyone followed Spartan law. The ephorate would eventually become one of the most powerful institutions in Sparta, wielding enormous authority over the lives of citizens. This system of checks and balances, mixing monarchy, oligarchy, and elements of democracy, struck many later Greek observers as ingenious. It prevented tyranny, the greatest fear of Greek political thinkers, by ensuring that no single individual or group could accumulate absolute power, but it also ensured that Sparta would be deeply conservative. Change required consensus among the kings, the Gerousia, and the assembly. This made Spartan government stable but also rigid, slow to adapt, and resistant to innovation. Part 2. The Spartan System. The agoge, forging weapons from boys to become a Spartan, was not a matter of birth alone. It was a process, a transformation, a forging in fire that began almost at the moment of birth and did not end until death. The Spartans believed that warriors were made, not born, and they created an education system designed to produce men who were physically tough, mentally disciplined, emotionally controlled, and absolutely obedient to the state. This system was called the agoge, and it was unlike anything else in the ancient world. When a child was born in Sparta, it was not immediately accepted into the family. Instead, it was brought before a council of elders who examined it carefully. They were looking for physical defects, signs of weakness or deformity. A child who was judged unfit was taken to a place called the Apothetai, a chasm in the Taygetus Mountains, and left to die. The Spartans did not see this as murder. They saw it as necessary quality control. A weak child would grow into a weak adult, and Sparta could not afford weakness. If a child passed this first test, it was returned to its mother for the first 7 years of its life. During these years, the child lived at home, cared for by its mother and nurses. But even here the agoge had begun. Spartan mothers were expected to raise their sons to be tough. Boys were encouraged to endure discomfort, to play rough games, to become accustomed to pain and hardship. At the age of 7, a boy was taken from his mother and entered the formal agoge system. From this point forward, he would live in barracks with other boys his age, under the supervision of older youths and adult trainers. His childhood was over, was now state property, being molded into a weapon. The agoge was organized into age groups, each with specific training goals and responsibilities. The youngest boys, aged 7 to 11, were called paidiskoi. Their training focused on physical conditioning, obedience, and basic military skills. They learned to march in formation, to handle weapons, and to endure physical hardship. But they also learned something more subtle, the suppression of individual identity in favor of group cohesion. Boys in the agoge did not wear comfortable clothing. They were given a single cloak, called a chiton, and wore it year-round, in the heat of summer and the cold of winter. They slept on beds they made themselves from reeds gathered from the Eurotas River, without blankets. They were fed deliberately inadequate rations, enough to survive but not enough to satisfy hunger. The purpose of this deprivation was twofold. First, it toughened the body, teaching boys to function while cold, hungry, and uncomfortable. Second, it encouraged them to steal food. This may seem paradoxical, but it was intentional. The Spartans wanted their boys to be resourceful, to learn how to acquire what they needed through cunning and daring. Stealing was not punished, but getting caught was punished severely. A boy who was caught stealing would be beaten, not for the theft itself, but for his lack of skill in avoiding detection. The most famous story illustrating this principle comes from the ancient writer Plutarch. He tells of a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. While the boy was standing at attention, the fox began to bite and claw at his stomach. Rather than cry out and reveal the theft, the boy stood silently, allowing the fox to literally disembowel him until he eventually collapsed and died. Plutarch presents this as the height of Spartan endurance and self-control. Modern readers might see it as the height of insanity, but the story captures something essential about what the agoge was designed to produce: men who would endure any suffering rather than admit weakness or failure. Physical training was constant and brutal. Boys ran long distances, wrestled, boxed, and practiced with weapons. They competed against each other in tests of strength and skill, with the winners earning prestige and the losers earning shame and punishment. The Spartans believed that competition made men stronger, that the constant pressure to prove oneself forged excellence. There was no sympathy for those who fell behind. A boy who could not keep up was mocked, beaten, and made an example of. The message was clear: weakness would not be tolerated. Music and dance were part of the education, but again, for specific purposes. Music was used to instill rhythm and coordination, essential for marching in formation and fighting in the phalanx. Dance served a similar function, teaching boys to move together as a unit. Spartan songs were almost exclusively martial in theme, praising courage, mocking cowardice, and celebrating death in battle. As boys grew older, the training intensified. At around age 12, they entered a new phase. The most significant change was that they were now subject to the supervision of older youths who had recently completed the agoge. These young men, typically in their late teens or early 20s, served as both mentors and tormentors. They were responsible for the younger boys' training, and they took this responsibility seriously, often in the harshest possible ways. One of the most controversial aspects of the agoge was the institutionalized pederasty that characterized these relationships. An older youth would select a younger boy as his eromenos, or beloved, and the two would form a bond that was simultaneously educational, emotional, and often sexual. This practice was not unique to Sparta. It existed in various forms across the Greek world, but the Spartans approached it with characteristic intensity and purpose. The relationship was meant to be formative, with the older partner serving as a role model and protector, instilling courage and virtue in the younger. The physical aspect of the relationship was acknowledged but not celebrated. At age 20, if a young man had successfully completed the agoge, he became a full citizen, a Spartiate, though he would not be fully independent for another 10 years. He would be assigned to a syzison, a mess group of about 15 men with whom he would eat every day for the rest of his life. The syzison was the basic unit of Spartan military and social organization. It was more than a military unit. It was a brotherhood, bound together by shared experiences, mutual dependence, and the knowledge that each man's survival depended on the others. Membership in a syzison was required to be a full citizen. Each member was expected to contribute a fixed amount of food each month, provided by the labor of his helots. If a man could not make his contribution, perhaps because his land was poor or his helots had fled, he would be expelled from the syzison and lose his citizenship. This system ensured that every Spartan had a direct economic interest in maintaining control over the helots. The entire agoge system, from childhood to adulthood, was designed to strip away individuality and replace it with collective identity. A Spartan did not think of himself as an individual with personal desires and goals. He thought of himself as a component of the Spartan state, valuable only insofar as he contributed to the whole. This produced extraordinary military effectiveness. Spartan soldiers were famously disciplined, capable of executing complex maneuvers on the battlefield with perfect coordination. But this came at a cost. The Spartans produced excellent soldiers, but stunted human beings. Women in Sparta, Spartan women, occupied a unique position in the Greek world, one that fascinated and often scandalized observers from other cities. While women in Athens were expected to remain indoors, managing the household and rarely appearing in public, Spartan women enjoyed a degree of freedom and authority that was exceptional for the ancient world. This difference was not the result of progressive values or feminist ideology. It was, like everything else in Sparta, the product of military necessity. Spartan men were required to live in their barracks and mess groups even after marriage, only visiting their wives occasionally. They were often away on campaign for months at a time. This meant that Spartan women had to manage estates, supervise helots, and make important decisions in the absence of their husbands. They could not be secluded or helpless. They needed to be strong, competent, and capable of exercising authority. Spartan girls, unlike girls in most other Greek cities, received a physical education. They trained in gymnastics, running, wrestling, and throwing the javelin and discus. They competed in athletic contests, sometimes performing nude, much to the shock of foreign observers. The purpose of this training was not recreational. The Spartans believed that physically fit women would bear stronger, healthier children. Since the entire system depended on producing excellent warriors, ensuring that mothers were healthy was a matter of state importance. Spartan women were also better educated than their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. They were literate, capable of managing complex households and estates. They were expected to be politically aware, to understand the issues facing Sparta, and to encourage their sons and husbands to uphold Spartan values. The most famous expression of Spartan motherhood is the command supposedly given by mothers to their sons departing for war. "Come back with your shield or on it." The shield was the most essential piece of hoplite equipment, and to lose it in battle was a mark of cowardice, as it suggested the soldier had thrown it away to run faster. The message was clear: victory or death, but never dishonor. Women could own property in Sparta, another unusual feature. Since men were often absent and frequently died in war, estates passed to widows and daughters more often than in other states. Over time, as the male population declined, an increasing proportion of Sparta's land came to be owned by women. By the 4th century BC, it is estimated that women owned as much as 2/5 of all Spartan land, the helots and the cryptaia. For all the attention paid to Spartan citizens, they were a small minority of the population. The foundation on which Spartan society rested was the helots, the enslaved Greek population of Laconia and especially Messenia. Understanding the helot system is essential to understanding Sparta, because the relationship between master and slave defined everything about how Sparta functioned. The helots were not like slaves in other Greek states. They were not purchased from foreign markets. They were not individuals who could be sold or freed at their master's discretion. They were an entire people, bound collectively to the land, required to farm it and hand over half their produce to the Spartan state, which then distributed it to individual citizens. In some ways, they resembled medieval serfs more than classical slaves. They had their own families, their own communities, their own internal social structures, but they had no freedom and no legal protection against abuse. The relationship between Spartans and Helots was characterized by systematic brutality. Every year, the ephors would declare war on the Helots. This was not a real war in the military sense. It was a ritual declaration that served a legal function. By declaring war, the ephors made it legal for Spartans to kill Helots without religious pollution or legal consequence. Murder, in Greek religious law, was a serious offense that brought divine punishment. But killing in war was acceptable. By perpetually keeping Helots in a state of war, the Spartans gave themselves license to use lethal violence whenever they deemed it necessary. The most infamous manifestation of this violence was the Crypteia, a secret institution that trained young Spartan men in covert operations and terrorism. When a young man was in his final years of training, before becoming a full citizen, he might be selected for the Crypteia. He would be given a knife and sent out into the countryside with minimal supplies. His mission was to live off the land, avoid detection, and kill Helots. The targets were not random. The Crypteia specifically aimed at Helots who seemed strong, capable, or potentially rebellious. A Helot man who was particularly fit, intelligent, or assertive was marked for death. The young Spartan would stalk his target, often for days, waiting for an opportunity when the Helot was alone and vulnerable. Then he would strike, killing the Helot and disappearing back into hiding. This was not war, it was state-sponsored terrorism, designed to decapitate any potential Helot leadership before it could organize resistance. The psychological impact of the Crypteia on both populations was profound. For the Helots, it created an atmosphere of constant terror. Any sign of strength or ambition could result in death. It was safer to appear weak, to keep one's head down, to accept one's fate. This suppressed Helot resistance for generations, making large-scale revolts rare, but it also ensured that when revolts did occur, they were apocalyptic in their fury. For the young Spartans participating in the Crypteia, the experience was formative in a different way. It taught them that violence was not just acceptable, but necessary. It desensitized them to killing. It trained them to see the Helots not as human beings, but as animals to be culled when they posed a threat. This was essential training for maintaining the system, but it also coarsened the Spartans, making them capable of atrocities that other Greeks found shocking. Yet despite all this oppression, the Helots survived. They maintained their communities, their language, their traditions. They remembered who they were, and this created a permanent instability at the heart of Sparta. The Spartans could never relax, never let down their guard, never trust that the Helots had truly accepted their enslavement. This paranoia shaped every aspect of Spartan foreign policy. Sparta was reluctant to send its army on distant campaigns because that would leave the homeland exposed to Helot revolt. The Spartan phalanx. All the social engineering, all the brutal training, all the systematic oppression of the Helots served a single purpose: to create the most effective heavy infantry force in the Greek world. That force was the Spartan phalanx, and for more than 2 centuries, it was virtually unbeatable. The phalanx was a formation of heavily armed infantry soldiers, called hoplites, standing shoulder to shoulder in multiple ranks. Each hoplite wore bronze armor, helmet, breastplate, and greaves to protect the legs. He carried a large round shield called a hoplon, and he wielded a long spear about 8 to 10 feet in length. At his side was a short sword for use if his spear broke. The genius of the phalanx lay in its collective strength. An individual hoplite was vulnerable. His shield protected his left side and part of the man standing to his left, but his right side was exposed. This meant each man depended on his neighbor to protect him. If a man broke and ran, he exposed the soldier next to him to attack. This created immense social pressure to stand firm. When two phalanxes met in battle, the result was a brutal shoving match. The front ranks would crash into each other, spears thrusting over shields, trying to find gaps in enemy armor. The men in rear ranks would push forward, adding their weight to the formation. The phalanx that maintained cohesion would usually win. The phalanx that broke apart would be slaughtered. This was where the Spartans excelled. While other Greek soldiers trained occasionally, Spartans trained every day. While other hoplites were farmers or merchants who fought when needed, Spartans were professional soldiers who did nothing but prepare for war. They practiced formations until they could execute complex maneuvers with perfect precision. Most importantly, Spartans did not break. The agoge had trained them from childhood to endure suffering, to suppress fear, to value death in battle above all other ends. The Spartans wore distinctive red cloaks, which supposedly helped hide blood and created a uniform, intimidating appearance. They marked their shields with the Greek letter lambda for Lacedaemon. Most Greek hoplites decorated shields with personal devices. The uniform lambda reinforced that Spartan soldiers were not individuals, but components of a collective force. For more than 200 years, the Spartan phalanx dominated Greek battlefields. Other states feared to fight them. This military supremacy would shape Sparta's role in Greek politics and lead it into the greatest conflict of the classical age. Part 3. The Persian Wars and Spartan Glory. Marathon and the Missed Opportunity. At the beginning of the 5th century BC, the Greek world faced an existential threat. The Persian Empire, the largest state the Mediterranean had ever seen, turned its attention westward. In 490 BC, a Persian force landed at Marathon, northeast of Athens. The Athenians, with a small Plataean contingent, met them in battle and won a stunning victory, killing thousands of Persians and driving the rest back to their ships. Sparta played no role in this victory. The Spartans had promised to send help, but claimed they could not march until after a religious festival concluded. By the time they arrived, the battle was over. Whether the religious excuse was genuine or pretext remains debated. What is clear is that Athens won glory while Sparta was absent, a fact that would haunt Spartan reputation. Thermopylae, the 300. A decade later, the new Persian king Xerxes prepared a massive invasion. An army ancient sources claimed numbered millions, though modern estimates suggest several 100,000, supported by an enormous fleet. This was not a raid, but a conquest. The Greeks formed the Hellenic League, with Sparta commanding due to its military prestige. The strategy was to delay the Persian advance at narrow choke points, while the Greek fleet, largely Athenian, defeated the Persian navy and cut off supply lines. The first stand came at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass where mountains met sea. Here, a small force could hold off a much larger army. King Leonidas commanded the blocking force, taking 300 Spartan citizens, plus several thousand allies. The choice to send only 300 Spartans has puzzled historians. Sparta could have fielded far more. The ancient explanation was religious, restrictions. A more cynical view suggests Sparta was hedging, sending enough to fulfill obligations, but not so many that it would weaken home defenses if the campaign failed. For 3 days, the Greeks held Thermopylae against the full Persian army. The narrow pass negated Persian numbers. Greek hoplites, fighting in tight formation with superior armor, slaughtered wave after wave. Xerxes watched in frustration as his elite immortals were thrown back with heavy losses. But the Greeks were betrayed. A local man named Ephialtes revealed a mountain path bypassing the Greek position. Xerxes sent forces along this route. By the 3rd day, realizing they'd be surrounded, most Greeks withdrew. Leonidas and his Spartans remained. along with Thespians and Thebans who refused to abandon them. The final stand was on a small hill within the pass. The end was inevitable. The Persians surrounded the position and cut down the defenders. Leonidas was killed, and Persians fought savagely to recover his body. According to Herodotus, the Spartans fought with spears until they broke, then swords until those shattered, and finally, with hands and teeth. Not one surrendered. Xerxes, enraged by the resistance, ordered Leonidas's head cut off and his body crucified, a profound dishonor in Greek culture. Thermopylae was a tactical defeat. The pass was lost, but it was a moral and strategic victory. The Spartans demonstrated that Persians were not invincible. The 3-day delay bought time for the Greek fleet, and it created a legend that validated everything the Agoge produced: men who did not fear death, who obeyed absolutely, who brought glory even in defeat. Plataea, the decisive victory. After Thermopylae, Persians marched south and burned Athens, which had been evacuated. But at Salamis, the Greek fleet shattered the Persian navy. Xerxes withdrew with much of his army, leaving his general Mardonius with substantial forces to complete the conquest. In spring 479 BC, Sparta finally mobilized fully. Regent Pausanias led the largest Spartan army ever fielded, including 5,000 Spartan citizens, perioikoi, helots as light infantry, and allied contingents totaling perhaps 100,000 men. This massive commitment reflected the dire situation. If Athens fell to Persia or switched sides, Sparta was doomed. The armies met near Plataea in Boeotia. After days of maneuvering, both seeking advantage, battle erupted. The Spartans found themselves facing the Persian assault's full weight. For a time, the situation was desperate. Persians had erected wicker shields and fired enormous arrow volleys, inflicting casualties on the Spartans standing in formation. Pausanias, according to tradition, refused to attack until omens were favorable. He ordered sacrifice after sacrifice, inspecting animal entrails for divine signs, while his men died. Finally, the signs turned favorable. Pausanias gave the order, and the Spartan phalanx charged. The Spartans smashed through the wicker wall and engaged Persians in close combat. Persians fought bravely, grabbing Greek spears with bare hands, trying to drag Spartans out of formation. But superior armor and training proved decisive. Spartans advanced relentlessly, killing Mardonius himself. With their general dead, the Persian line broke and fled. The rest of the Greek army rallied and joined the attack. Persians retreated to their fortified camp, but Greeks breached the walls. What followed was a massacre. Trapped Persians were slaughtered almost to a man. Only a small portion escaped back to Asia. Plataea ended the Persian invasion. It was the decisive land battle, and it was Sparta's victory. Pausanias was hailed as Greece's liberator. Sparta's reputation reached its zenith. Thermopylae's legend was now coupled with Plataea's reality. Sparta had saved Greece, but victory contained future problem seeds. Athens and Sparta had different visions of what should come next. Athens wanted to take the war to Persia, liberating Ionian Greeks. Sparta wanted to consolidate its position and avoid distant entanglements, leaving helots unsupervised. And Pausanias himself would soon become a problem, accused of treason and conspiring with Persians. Whether true or fabricated, the accusations reflected growing anxiety within Sparta about power's corrupting influence. Part 4. The Road to War with Athens. The Unraveling Alliance. After the Persian Wars, Sparta was Greece's undisputed leader, but Sparta was also exhausted and anxious. Long mobilization had strained resources and left helots unsupervised. Spartans wanted nothing more than to return home and resume internal focus. Athens, by contrast, was energized and ambitious. In 478 BC, Athens formed a new alliance, the Delian League, to continue war against Persia. Initially consisting of Aegean city-states, each would contribute ships or money to a common war fund. Athens would provide leadership and military force. Sparta did not object openly. It was relieved to be free of distant campaign burdens. For a time, this division of responsibilities seemed workable. Sparta on land, Athens at sea. But the Delian League quickly evolved into something more than defensive alliance. Athens began dominating its allies, insisting on financial contributions even from states wanting to provide ships. When members attempted to withdraw, Athens used force to compel them to remain. The most famous case was Naxos, which tried to secede around 470 BC. Athens besieged the island and forced it to remain on harsher terms. The Delian League was becoming an Athenian empire. This transformation was gradual but relentless. The treasury moved from Delos to Athens in 454 BC. Contributions were increasingly called tribute. Athens interfered in allied states' internal affairs, imposing democratic governments. By mid-century, what began as a free states alliance had become an empire ruled from Athens. Sparta watched with growing unease, and Athens, controlling hundreds of city-states and commanding the seas, was very different from the useful ally against Persia. But Sparta was not ready for war. It had its own problems, the Great Earthquake and Helot Revolt. In 464 BC, disaster struck Laconia. A massive earthquake devastated the region, destroying much of Sparta itself. Ancient sources describe buildings collapsing, killing thousands of citizens. The death toll significantly reduced Spartiate numbers. Natural disasters are terrible, but for Sparta, the earthquake was catastrophic in a specific way. It created the opportunity Helots had been waiting for. With the city in ruins, the army disorganized, and significant citizen numbers dead, Messenian Helots rose in revolt. This was not spontaneous riot, but organized insurrection, suggesting Helots had been planning, waiting for the right moment. The revolt spread quickly across Messenia. Helots seized weapons, killed Spartan overseers, and fortified mountain positions. The scale was enormous, involving tens of thousands. It was the nightmare scenario Spartan society was designed to prevent. King Archidamus II rallied survivors and organized defense. The immediate priority was preventing revolt from spreading to Laconia, where Helots outnumbered Spartans even more dramatically. Spartan forces moved quickly to secure key positions, but crushing the revolt proved difficult. Messenian Helots, knowing they faced death or re-enslavement if they lost, fought with desperate courage. They fortified Mount Etome, a nearly impregnable natural fortress in central Messenia. From this position, they raided Spartan territory and encouraged more Helots to join. Spartans besieged Etome, but could not take it by assault. Sparta found itself in a grinding attrition war. In desperation, Sparta did something unprecedented. It asked for help. Messages went to allies, including Athens, requesting assistance. Athens sent substantial forces under General Cimon, known to be pro-Spartan. But when Athenians arrived, Spartan attitudes changed. They looked at these democratic soldiers and feared Athenians might sympathize with Helots rather than help suppress them. Spartans told Athenians their services were no longer needed. This was a profound insult. Athenians had come at Sparta's request and were now dismissed. The Athenian assembly was outraged. Cimon was ostracized. Athens formally broke its alliance with Sparta and instead allied with Argos, Sparta's old enemy. The diplomatic rupture was complete. The Helot revolt dragged on for years. Eventually, after nearly a decade, Helots agreed to surrender on terms. They could leave the Peloponnese with their families under truce rather than face execution. Athens, seizing an opportunity to weaken Sparta, offered surrendered Helots refuge in Naupactus. There they remained as exiled Messenians, maintaining their identity and nursing hatred of Sparta. The revolt was over, but consequences were profound. Sparta had lost significant citizen population in the earthquake. It had fought a long, costly war, exposing vulnerabilities. Its relationship with Athens was destroyed, and it learned the Helot system was not as secure as needed. The stage was set for larger conflict. The Peloponnesian War begins. The Peloponnesian War began in 431 BC, triggered by disputes involving Sparta's allies but driven by deeper causes. As Thucydides wrote, the true cause was Athenian power's growth and Spartan fear. Sparta planned to invade Attica and force Athens into decisive battle. Athens, under Pericles, would withdraw behind walls, import supplies by sea, and use its navy to raid Sparta's coasts until Sparta exhausted itself. Neither strategy worked perfectly. Spartan invasions achieved nothing. Athens refused battle. But crowded inside walls, Athens suffered a devastating plague, killing perhaps a third of its population, including Pericles. The war became a grinding stalemate. In 425 BC, an Athenian fleet landed at Pylos in Messenia. Recognizing the strategic value, General Demosthenes fortified it as a permanent base. Pylos was in Helot country, and an Athenian fort there was intolerable. Spartans responded urgently. They rushed to Pylos to drive out Athenians. A large Spartan force, including several hundred Spartiates on nearby Sphacteria Island, attempted to assault the position. The assault failed. Worse, the Athenian fleet arrived and trapped Spartans on Sphacteria. Now Spartans faced disaster. Several hundred citizens, including many from prominent families, were besieged. If killed or captured, it would be catastrophic loss for Sparta's declining citizen population. Spartans made the unprecedented decision to ask for armistice and peace negotiations. Athenian terms were harsh, and negotiations broke down. After weeks, with trapped Spartans starving, Athenians launched a final assault. The Spartans, weakened, put up desperate resistance but were eventually overwhelmed. In a moment that shocked all Greece, the surviving Spartans surrendered. This was incomprehensible. Spartans did not surrender. The entire Spartan ethos was that death in battle was preferable to captivity. Yet here were 120 Spartiates allowing themselves to be taken prisoner. The prisoners were brought to Athens and held as hostages. Pylos damaged Sparta's reputation and exposed vulnerability. Athenians held prisoners representing a significant fraction of Sparta's citizen body. They had established a permanent base in Messenia, encouraging Helots to escape. The psychological impact was immense. The peace of Nicias and Sicilian disaster. The war ground on. In 422 BC, both the most hawkish leaders, Athens's Cleon and Sparta's Brasidas, were killed at Amphipolis. Their deaths removed main obstacles to peace. In 421 BC, they concluded the Peace of Nicias, intended to end war and restore the status quo. But the peace was doomed. Many of Sparta's allies refused to sign, feeling betrayed. In Athens, there was dissatisfaction, and there was Alcibiades, young, charismatic, brilliant, utterly without scruples. He began working to undermine the treaty. Within years, the peace collapsed. In 418 BC, Sparta marched against Argos at the Battle of Mantinea. King Agis II was determined to restore Sparta's damaged reputation. The battle was hard fought, but Spartan superior discipline proved decisive. They broke the enemy and routed the coalition army. Mantinea restored morale and demonstrated Pylos had been an aberration. But it did not end the war. In 415 BC came the turning point. The city of Segesta in Sicily appealed to Athens for help. Alcibiades proposed not a small expedition, but massive invasion aimed at conquering Syracuse, Sicily's largest city. The proposal was audacious to the point of recklessness. Syracuse was a major power far from Athens. Launching large-scale expedition across the Mediterranean while still at war with Sparta was extraordinarily risky. Yet the Athenian assembly approved. A fleet of more than 100 ships carrying thousands of troops was prepared, the largest force Athens ever sent overseas. Before reaching Sicily, Alcibiades was recalled to stand trial for religious vandalism. Fearing conviction, he defected to Sparta, advising them how to defeat Athens, send help to Syracuse, and establish a permanent fort at Deceleia in Attica. The Sicilian expedition became one of history's greatest military disasters. The siege of Syracuse dragged on inconclusively. The Athenian fleet was trapped in Syracuse harbor and destroyed. The army retreating overland was hunted down and annihilated. Thousands died or were thrown into stone quarries where they perished slowly. Nearly half of Athens' military capacity was destroyed. Spartan victory Sparta, encouraged by Athens' catastrophic defeat and funded by Persian gold, built a navy under Admiral Lysander. Following Alcibiades' advice, they fortified Deceleia, raiding Athenian territory year-round and making agriculture impossible. The war became a contest of naval engagements in the eastern Aegean. Athens managed to continue fighting despite losses, but it was running on empty. Its treasury was depleted, manpower stretched thin, allies increasingly unreliable. Lysander, through military skill and political maneuvering, gradually isolated Athens. He captured key Athenian bases in the Hellespont, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea. This was crucial because Athens imported grain from the Black Sea region. The decisive moment came in 405 BC at Aegospotami. The Athenian fleet, exhausted and weakened, made camp on an exposed beach. Lysander attacked at dawn when Athenian sailors were scattered and unprepared. The result was massacre. The Spartan fleet captured or destroyed nearly the entire Athenian navy. Lysander executed most of the thousands of Athenian sailors taken prisoner. With its fleet destroyed and food supply cut, Athens was doomed. The city endured a siege throughout winter, 405–404 BC, slowly starving. In spring 404 BC, Athens surrendered. Terms were harsh but not catastrophic. Athens would dismantle its walls, surrender its remaining ships except 12, give up its empire, and become a Spartan ally. The city would not be destroyed. Sparta's victory was complete. Sparta was now Greece's undisputed hegemon, more powerful than ever before. But this victory contained Sparta's destruction seeds. The war had lasted 27 years, exhausted Greece, and forced Sparta to fundamentally change, allying with Persia, building a navy, taking on hegemony burdens its system couldn't handle. Part 5. Decline and Fall, the Fragile Hegemony. Sparta was profoundly unsuited for hegemony. Its system produced excellent soldiers, but poor administrators. It had no tradition of diplomacy, no experience managing an empire, no infrastructure for governing foreign territories. Lysander installed dekarches, governments of 10 men, in cities across the former Athenian Empire, backed by Spartan garrisons. But these oligarchies were often brutal and corrupt, alienating populations. Spartan governors sometimes abused power or became entangled in local politics, and Sparta itself was divided about what its foreign policy should be. Lysander represented those wanting to maintain and expand hegemony, but his ambitions made him dangerous. The ephors and kings feared he might attempt to overthrow the Spartan constitution, they recalled him and curtailed his power. Without strong central authority, cities Sparta was leading began to drift. Less than a decade after defeating Athens, a coalition including Thebes, Corinth, Argos, and a recovered Athens fought Sparta in the Corinthian War, 395–386 BC. States that had fought alongside Sparta against Athens now resented Spartan dominance. Sparta won battles but couldn't achieve strategic victory. The war ended only when Sparta appealed to Persia to impose peace. The resulting king's peace was a profound humiliation. Persian king Artaxerxes II dictated terms. Greek cities of Ionia and Cyprus would belong to Persia. All other Greek states would be autonomous. Persia guaranteed the peace. Sparta had betrayed everything it claimed to stand for. The city that led Greece against Persia now used Persian authority to maintain dominance. Cities of Ionia, which Sparta promised to liberate, were handed back to Persia. The hypocrisy was blatant and damaged Sparta's moral authority irreparably. The demographic crisis. While attempting to manage external empire, Sparta faced acute internal crises. The most serious was demographic collapse. The number of full Spartan citizens was declining precipitously. At the Persian Wars, there had been perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 Spartiates. By the Peloponnesian War's end, perhaps 5,000. By the 370s BC, below 2,000. This decline was catastrophic for a military state whose power rested on its citizen army. War took its toll, but deeper problems drove the decline. Property concentrated in fewer hands. Spartan law allowed women to inherit, and as families died out, increasing land came under female ownership or wealthy families. This created inequality at odds with Spartan ideals. Citizenship required making monthly contributions to one's succession from land worked by helots. If a man lost his land or his helots fled, he couldn't contribute. He'd lose citizenship, becoming an inferior. Once lost, citizenship couldn't be regained. The system maintained a fixed citizen body with no provisions for expansion or renewal. The result was a vicious cycle. As citizen numbers declined, each remaining citizen worked harder. Military duties became more burdensome. Fear of helot revolt intensified. The state relied more on perioikoi, helots, and mercenaries, eroding army quality. Economic inequality created social tension. The myth of equality collapsed, and with it, the social cohesion that made Sparta strong. The rise of Theban power. Thebes was not supposed to threaten Sparta. It was a mid-sized Boeotian city with respectable military tradition, but nothing comparable to Sparta's dominance. In 379 BC, Theban exiles returned and launched a coup, overthrowing the Spartan-backed oligarchy and driving out the garrison. Sparta, outraged, sent armies to retake the city. But Thebes fought back. The Theban army, led by Pelopidas and Epaminondas, defeated several Spartan expeditions. These weren't decisive victories, but demonstrated Thebans could hold their own. The aura of Spartan invincibility was fading. Epaminondas was key to Thebes's rise. A philosopher and general, he recognized that traditional phalanx fighting favored Spartans due to superior training. To defeat Sparta, Thebes needed innovation. He developed tactics based on concentration of force, massing best troops on one wing in extraordinary depth rather than deploying uniformly. He trained the Sacred Band, an elite force of 300 men organized as pairs of lovers. He coordinated cavalry and light infantry with the phalanx in innovative ways. Leuctra. The myth shattered. These innovations were tested at Leuctra in 371 BC, one of history's most important military engagements. Sparta, determined to crush Theban resistance, invaded Boeotia with substantial forces. The armies met near Leuctra, Spartans, confident, deployed in standard formation with the Spartiate corps on the right wing. Epaminondas deployed differently. He massed best troops, including the Sacred Band, on his left wing opposite the Spartan right, 50 ranks deep, far deeper than the standard 8. He refused his center and right wing, pulling them back to engage later. The plan was to strike Spartans with overwhelming force at one point, break their line, then roll up the rest. When lines met, Theban left wing's depth and weight proved decisive. Spartans, fighting as always, found themselves outnumbered at the point of contact. The Theban phalanx drove forward relentlessly. The Spartans, for the first time in living memory, broke. They fled, leaving behind hundreds of dead, including King Cleombrotus and 400 Spartiots. The casualties were staggering. 400 Spartiate deaths represented perhaps a fifth of the entire remaining citizen body, but the psychological blow exceeded material damage. Sparta had been defeated in open battle, decisively, by a supposedly inferior state. The myth of Spartan invincibility shattered in a single afternoon. Leuctra changed Greek politics overnight. States cowed by Spartan power saw opportunity. Sparta's allies began defecting, its enemies grew bold, and in Messenia, Helots heard the news and understood their moment had finally come, the liberation of Messenia. In winter 370-369, BC, Epaminondas led a massive army into the Peloponnese. This was not a raid, but invasion, including Thebans and contingents from states eager to see Sparta humbled. The army marched through Laconia itself, devastating the countryside. For the first time in centuries, foreign soldiers ravaged Sparta's heartland. Spartans, though with diminished forces, could do little. They fortified the city, preparing for siege. But Epaminondas did not attack Sparta directly. He had a more strategic goal. He led his army west, across the Taygetus Mountains, into Messenia. There, Epaminondas made an announcement that reverberated through the ancient world. Messenia was free. After nearly 4 centuries of enslavement, the Messenian Helots were liberated. They were no longer Spartan property. They were citizens of a restored Messenian nation. To make liberation permanent, Epaminondas supervised construction of a new city, Messene, built on a defensible site with massive fortifications. He invited exiled Messenians to return and populate the new city. He helped establish Messenian government and army. In months, he created a viable state that could defend itself. The liberation was Sparta's death blow. Overnight, Sparta lost half its territory and more than half its economic base. The Helots who farmed Messenian land for centuries were gone. The food they produced no longer flowed to Sparta. Spartan citizens, already struggling with declining numbers, now had to work their own lands or rely entirely on Laconian Helots. Sparta's military strength evaporated. Without manpower from Messenian Helots serving as light infantry, the army shrank dramatically. Without Messenia's economic resources, Sparta couldn't afford mercenaries. The state that once fielded tens of thousands now struggled to muster a few thousand. The psychological impact was equally devastating. The entire Spartan identity was built on Messenia's conquest and control. The Second Messenian War had forged the Spartan system, and now Messenia was gone. The Helots had won. Everything Sparta had done, all the brutality, fear, rigid discipline, had been for nothing. Failed reforms and continued decline. The decades following Messenia's liberation were characterized by desperation and failed renewal attempts. Sparta's leaders understood something had to change, but changing the system ran counter to everything Sparta stood for. The Lycurgan laws were supposed to be eternal, divinely inspired, unchangeable. In the mid-3rd century BC, King August IV proposed radical reforms: cancel debts, redistribute land, create new citizens. These reforms were revolutionary, facing fierce opposition from wealthy elites. August built support among the poor and disenfranchised. For a brief moment, Sparta might reinvent itself. But the reform movement failed. Wealthy Spartans, controlling the Gerousia and having allies among ephors, maneuvered against August. They delayed implementation, created legal obstacles, spread rumors he was attempting tyranny. When August left on campaign, they struck. They declared him a public enemy. When he returned, they arrested and executed him by strangulation. A generation later, King Cleomenes III attempted similar reforms. He was more ruthless, using military force to seize power, killing opposing ephors, and driving his co-king into exile. He implemented sweeping reforms, canceling debts, redistributing land, creating thousands of new citizens. For a time, reforms seemed to work. Sparta's army increased. The state regained military effectiveness, but external intervention doomed the movement. The Achaean League, desperate to stop Cleomenes, appealed to Macedon. Macedon sent an army south. Cleomenes was defeated at Silesia in 222 BC and fled to Egypt. Sparta was occupied and reforms were reversed. After Cleomenes, Sparta never again attempted serious reform. It continued existing but was a shadow. No significant military power, no economic base, no political influence. The once proud city became a curiosity, a living museum. Sparta under Rome. When Rome conquered Greece in the 2nd century BC, Sparta became a client state with nominal independence. Under Roman rule, it became a tourist attraction. Wealthy Romans visited to see the famous city and its ancient customs, fascinated by the agoge and stories of past glory. The Spartans, recognizing a market, staged mock battles and demonstrated training methods for Roman audiences, a living history exhibition. Some Romans found this admirable, preservation of ancient virtue. Others found it sad, a once great power reduced to entertainment. The agoge continued, but now as ritual rather than military necessity. There were no helots to control, no enemies to defeat. It was training warriors for a war that would never come. The Spartan identity, once so distinctive and powerful, blended into broader Greek culture of the Roman East. By the early medieval period, Sparta, as a distinct entity, had ceased to exist. The settlement was renamed Lacedaemon, an unimportant town notable only for historical associations. The ancient ruins were buried under centuries of soil. Sparta had simply vanished. Conclusion. Lessons from the ruins. Why Sparta failed, the decline and fall of Sparta, is one of the most instructive case studies in the fragility of systems built on fear and rigid discipline. The first and most fundamental problem was the helot system itself. Sparta's entire society was built on enslaving a population that outnumbered citizens perhaps 7 or 8 to 1. This created permanent low-level warfare within Spartan territory. Every Spartan had to be a soldier, not to conquer foreign lands, but to control people in their midst. This meant Sparta could never relax, never redirect resources toward anything other than internal security. The second major problem was demographic. Sparta's citizen population declined steadily, and there was no mechanism for renewal. Other Greek states could grant citizenship to freed slaves, foreign residents, allies. Sparta could not do this without fundamentally changing citizenship's basis. To be a Spartiate required being born into it and surviving the agoges. Every Spartiate death was permanent.